Welcome to the Nick Doesn't Know How to Light Videos show, where we have a bunch of amateurs trying to do things.
We have clowns who use Google Scholar. Our last video was about policing in America and its shortcomings, and we mentioned in that video that there was enough information on the topic of policing queer people throughout American history that we could have made a whole separate video on it, if enough people showed interest. And a lot of people did, and somebody actually asked if we could make a video that they could show to their high school GSA all about this topic. So we are going to try to keep this as PG-13 as we can.
I fought with the notion because I am very much against censorship, but I also like enabling children with knowledge.
Educating the youth. We are going to try to avoid swearing as much as we can, and per my request, if any swears slip through in honor of Untitled Goose Game, we'll be censoring them with goose honks. This is my chromed book.
Thank you. Very cool.
Shut up, I'm gonna come over there and harm you. This video will be about the history of policing queerness in America. So the way we formatted this is we're essentially going to take a timeline perspective, moving from the 1500s all the way through the 2000s, to kind of break down the different eras of policing. Gays against cops! So a few notes before the video starts officially. I'm going to be using the word queer a lot in this because I'm specifically using it in reference to like queer theory and queer studies, which were popularized in the 80s in academia. We're not just discussing experiences or emotions associated with being LGBT, we're critically examining societal structures and frameworks that oppress folks based on what they can't control. And so that specifically is why we're using the word queer as opposed to LGBT. And in that same additional note, you will hear some words in this video, or its second part, we're breaking it up into two parts because this is a lot of information. Words that are now considered slurs that were not slurs at their conception. They were actually words used in queer communities to designate certain identities. And we're not going to censor those, but just like be prepared that you'll hear that. And of course, general content notice, we're going to be discussing the oppression of queer people and like police oppressing queer people in America. So there's going to be mentions of, you know, violence and homophobia and transphobia abound. Just mentally steel thyself.
Trigger warning.
So the beginning. I'm talking like the 1500s. Pre-police, pre-colonization. America is still Turtle Island. White people don't exist in this realm. Everything is great. And then everything changed when the white man attacked.
And then white people.
So indigenous Americans were way more accepting of queerness and queer people. The strongest evidence pointing in this direction is the celebrated existence of two spirits. Two spirits, which is abbreviated as TS or 2S, the number, are indigenous American people who occupy a distinct tribal gender. This has a different word for most tribes, but two-spirit is the pan-indigenous terms. The Indian Health Service Organization describes two-spirit as people who were female, male, sometimes intersex, who combined activities of both men and women with traits unique to their status as two-spirit people. In most tribes, they were considered neither men nor women. They occupied a distinct alternative gender status. In tribes where two-spirit males and females were referred to with the same term, the status amounted to a third gender. In other cases, two-spirit females were referred to with a distinct term and therefore constituted a fourth gender. Many of the 500 to 600 indigenous tribes in America have their own word for third, fourth, even fifth genders, and lots of two-spirit individuals were celebrated healers and teachers who were able to combine both gendered walks of life in their experiences. Queerness in indigenous America has existed outside of the realm of two-spirit individuals as well. In her book, The Queerness of Native American Literature, American ethnic studies professor Lisa Tadanetti states that, quote, histories of gender variance and stories about and by what we might today broadly define as queer Native people have existed in the land now called North America, since the first people to live on this land fell from the sky, emerged from below, or migrated here as the glaciers crept forward. And in the same book, she cites the Gay American Indians Organization, which was founded in 1975 by Barbara Cameron and Randy Burns. In an interview, Burns had explained that the goal of the organization was, quote, really trying to break down the stereotypes in both directions. In the Indian community, we are trying to realign ourselves with the trampled traditions of our people. Gay people were respected parts of tribes. So with colonization came police, which damages queer folks, especially indigenous queer folks. This demonstration of how queer lives were valued pre-colonization and pre-police establishes a sort of dichotomy between like the way people are treated pre- and post-colonization, and also creates an association between anti-queer behaviors and police behaviors. In her essay, Punks, Bulldaggers, and Welfare Queens, political scientist, author, and overall amazing person, Kathy J. Cohen eloquently sums it up. She says that many of the roots of heteronormativity are in white supremacist ideologies which sought and continue to use the state and its regulation of sexuality, in particular through the institution of heterosexual marriage, to designate which individuals were truly fit for full rights and privileges of citizenship.
Sorry, I'm blanking out. Hold on. I can make a thought.
Do it. I project my brain cell into you.
Eli has the brain cell.
I've been at college, so I've had the brain cell for like 8 weeks now. Nick is dying.
The brain cell is Bluetooth, right? There is some folks in Wisconsin that are trying to Bluetooth the brain cell, and then there's Eli in Illinois trying to Bluetooth the brain cell, and
Some of you in the comments section Bluetooth the brain cell. Others of you do not.
Basically, when white people were like, hey, I don't like your culture, take my culture. And white people's culture is like, no gays, bad gays. And that's rooted in, religion and stuff. You know how it is with Abrahamic religions.
From the second police became a thing through colonization of the Americas, so did anti-queerness. Like that, I cannot emphasize enough how respected queer people were pre-colonization.
And that's in more places than North America.
Absolutely.
That's Africa, some Asian countries. It's all linked to colonization.
Speaking of marriage and marriage equality.
Oof.
Yikes. Indigenous tribes in America placed way less emphasis on the nuclear family traditional marriage sort of thing. And marriage wasn't really connected to one's civil rights as it is today. Also, polyamorous marriages were really popular. For example, a Crow female warrior named Woman Chief left behind 4 wives upon her death.
What a baller.
Your fave could never.
You have your new icon. Why love Ellen DeGeneres when you could love...
Y'all are still standing Ellen DeGeneres? That's your lesbian? The element of the settler heteropatriarchy is the connection between marriage and legal rights. Indigenous and queer theorist Kim Tallbear, who you can find on the blog Critical Polyamorist, has stated, quote, Indigenous people were forced into monogamy and state-sanctioned marriage. Those relationship forms were intimately tied up with the appropriation of Indigenous collectively held land and its division into individual allotments to be held privately. That's the Allotment Act of 17 whatever, and that was a big part of stealing land from Indigenous people. Men, as heads of households, qualified for a certain acreage. They obtained more if they had a wife and children. Women, of course, were economically tied to men. So this trend of tying marriage to civil rights would become deeply embedded in American culture, all the way up to the point where, like, that is what people latched onto during the gay rights movement. Like, post-Stonewall, people really grabbed onto the idea of marriage equality, as if there's anything equal about marriage in America. My point is that a key element of suppressing people of color has also been marriage. Racism and queerphobia are very, very tightly linked because they both are descendants of colonization.
It all starts with colonization.
It all starts with colonization. It's all tied together. And if you are confused by that statement, you should look up the theory of intersectionality. Now we move on from the 1500s. We enter the 1600s, the Puritan era of America. So in the late 16th century, a religious reformation movement known as Puritanism kind of did that to the Church of England. I'm trying to say the Church of England.
Honk.
And then it reached the colonies of the New World. So Puritan beliefs really shaped everything. Like, the church and state held very close hands when it came to Puritanism. Generally, Puritans believed that godly folks were sober, hardworking, responsible, and they placed great value in education. But they also practiced great intolerance and a belief that any error must be opposed and driven out. Now, my research has revealed that Puritans, as individuals, had conflicting beliefs about queerness. So Vice author Matt Baum wrote about this, explaining that, quote, despite many settlements calling for the death penalty for sodomy, colonizers found that conditions were so harsh and the community so delicate that it was inadvisable to kill, except in the most extreme cases. As a result, they often found reason to forgive same-sex intercourse when it was discovered. But even if the Puritans were too busy dying of starvation to kill gay people, the sentiment was still there. And there was still that societal attitude towards queerness, which is a complete 180 from what we saw just 50 years prior with pre-colonization America. Plymouth adopted an anti-sodomy law in 1636 because of Puritan political influence. And Puritans drew insight from the biblical book of Leviticus. Yikes! Which Leviticus is very well quoted by homophobes, mostly.
We've all heard it.
Leviticus 18:22 stating, Man shall not lie with a male as one lies with a female. It is an abomination. And Leviticus 20:13 stating, if there is a man who lies with a male as those who lie with a woman, both have committed a detestable act. There is some dispute over the translation of that first quote. In particular, some people say it has been mistranslated and it is actually meant to be an anti-pedophilia statement. Thou shalt not lie with boy like one lies with woman. I have no statement on the credibility of that translation in either direction, but as a general statement, the Bible does not like gay people. Like, even in the New Testament, you'll find people like saying homosexuality is an abomination. Like, there's really no way to make the Bible queer friendly. Except for that one quote that's like, there's no man nor woman, just people who like God. Third gender, people who like God. So following Plymouth, we have New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island all adopting anti-sodomy laws based off of this Puritan tomfoolery. So this made sodomy a capital offense, which means you get the death penalty. What's sodomy? Thanks for asking. Sodomy has various definitions depending on where in time you look at the law, but generally sodomy refers to morally inexcusable sexual acts, which usually include things like pedophilia, bestiality, and being gay. One of those things, you may notice, is not like the others, and we'll get to that in a moment. Non-baby sex was also a no-no. And so in different statutes, even like masturbation was you to get the death penalty. Anti-sodomy laws did technically have elements of the statute that would apply to straight couples, or even just like solo acts like masturbation, or even like elements of indecent exposure. But even up into like the 1900s with cases like Bowers versus Hardwick, which was in the 80s, a lot of these anti-sodomy laws were being enforced exclusively against queer people. So I don't want to see any of that in the comments. That's gonna be like, sodomy punishes this and that. Not really. It was only enforced against gay people, and that is a very apparent fact when you look at court cases that deal with sodomy laws. Sodomy was a capital offense in various states, and similar English sodomy laws were added in New York, New Jersey, and eventually Pennsylvania after the Quakers were no longer cool. Gender nonconformity was also a big no-no in Puritan society. Puritan ministers were big fans of male supremacy, and it was taught that the soul had two halves, the superior male half and the inferior female half. In short, women were not allowed to do a number of things. This includes, but is not limited to, participating in town meetings, making decisions in church, using contraception, possessing property, signing contracts, conducting business, or showing their hair or arms in public. There was no room for gender nonconformity, not even on a superficial level. Women who dressed immodestly would be taken into the town square, stripped to the waist, and whipped on the back in public, then made to confess their sins in church in front of the whole congregation. So coming to the end of the Puritan era, what we've seen is a complete 180 shift from the way that queer people were treated pre-colonization and the way they have now been treated post-colonization. And we see this in a lot of different elements. The institution as marriage being the pinnacle of having rights and holding like any social position even. We see very close ties between church and state, and we see the complete suppression of queerness. Whether that be having sex, which is controlled through sodomy laws, gender nonconforming expression, which is controlled through things like public decency laws, which means you can't roll your sleeves up to your elbow or you get a beating. It's just bad, like it's a total 180, and it does not get better, because then the police get guns.
Oh.
So the colonial era, 1700s and most of the 1800s as well. The colonial era, aka slave owning, the Revolutionary War, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution. We become states instead of colonies.
Police.
By the time the Bill of Rights was adopted in 1791, 12 of the 13 states had anti-sodomy laws, most of which were adapted directly from English Commonwealth law. But however, the Bill of Rights did include the Ninth Amendment, which would later be contested as a person's right to privacy, including whatever they wanted to do in the bedroom, so long as it didn't violate obscenity laws, which is stuff like pedophilia and bestiality. However, there was no specific language in the Ninth Amendment that said anything about sodomy laws, so they remained intact. So the punishments for sodomy were changed. For example, in the state constitution of Pennsylvania, sodomy, which was also called buggery, I charge you with buggery. So in Pennsylvania, it was decided via the new constitution that sodomy should no longer be a capital offense, and that the severity of the punishment should match the severity of the crime. In 1786, Pennsylvania passed an act amending the penal laws. They really went ham with the creativity of these laws, and declared that anyone convicted of, quote, robbery, burglary, sodomy, or buggery, quote, end quote, would not be put to death, but rather would be forced to give up all their lands and good to the state and endure 10 years of servitude. It may seem like a step in the right direction because gay people are no longer getting hanged in the town square, but it really isn't. There's still the association between gayness and policing and being criminalized. This statute alone places sodomy and, by direct association, gay people on the same criminal level as robbing a person or burglarizing a residence. So in Pennsylvania, having sex with a man was the same as breaking into someone's house and stealing stuff. That makes sense. The practice of grouping sodomy together with other crimes was really popular in European law, which is where America got most of its laws. For example, French judge and philosopher Montesquieu noted in his treatise The Spirit of the Laws that sodomy was one of the 3 crimes that could result in being burned at the stake. The other 2 were witchcraft and hearsay.
Oh my god, being gay means witchcraft.
They're not wrong, but they shouldn't have said it. Similarly, Italian criminologist Beccaria grouped sodomy with adultery and infanticide in his treatise on crimes and punishment. Did you know being gay is just like murdering a kid?
If you murder a child, you're gay. I don't make the
I don't make the rules, Beccaria does. Now you might be thinking, who gives a shit what these 2 guys said? America did. Statesman, State Secretary, President, General, godly mistake, Thomas Jefferson took great inspiration from both of these men. And he proposed that various crimes be excluded from the 8th Amendment, the one that protects prisoners against cruel and unusual punishment. Jefferson suggested that sodomites, along with rapists, should be excluded from 8th Amendment protections, and instead of being put into prison or having all their stuff taken away, they should be castrated. Or, if the sodomite in question is a female, mutilated by having a hole pierced through her tongue. Isn't that nice? This suggestion did make it into a bill in 1779, but ended up not entering the Virginian Constitution. Rather, a revised 1792 bill, that's 1 year after the ratification of the Bill of Rights, made sodomy a capital offense, quote, without benefit of clergy, end quote, and carrying a mandatory death sentence. So following Virginia and Pennsylvania's lead, most of the other original colonies adapted their sodomy laws and generally settled on a punishment of 10-year servitude, with some state-specific variations. The most conservative of these revised laws were in the Carolinas. North Carolina's revised legal code of 1855 kept the death penalty. That was later changed to a range of 5 to 60 years in prison in 1869, which is, I don't know how you can have such a massive range. South Carolina kept the death penalty for sodomy until 1873, which was 12 years after England changed their sodomy death penalty. South Carolina stinky. The second part will be dealing with the 1900s and 2000s. Which is less time than we have covered in this section, but way more information, because here we see the progressive era and civil rights activism, we see Stonewall, and everything that happens after that. And our conclusion is going to include some modern interpretation of what all of this historical it means for us people living here today in 2019, soon to be 2020.
I think by now you're thinking, what does this have to do with police?
The police are people who enforce the law. And you might be thinking, well, it's not their fault. Yes, it is. If you voluntarily sign up to enforce unjust laws, you become complicit in the enforcement, and therefore complicit in the repeated and state-sanctioned harm of marginalized people. And it's always been that way. We will see more involvement from actual police officers in the 1900s, with Stonewall riots, with Bowers versus Hardwick, stuff like that. But just remember, laws would not be enforced without police, and if the laws are unjust, the police are unjust as well. And when I talk about policing, I don't just mean guys in blue uniforms. Anybody can police. To police somebody is to suppress them in some way, to enforce control over their actions, their beliefs, their behaviors. And it is a tactic employed by majority communities to suppress and further marginalize minority communities. Community policing takes place all the time and in all walks of life. In the paper I wrote for my writing seminar, I read some papers about community policing in gay villages in Chicago. So this was stuff in like 2016, 2017, where gay nonprofits like Broadway Center for Youth were turning away homeless queer youth. That's a form of community policing. Don't just think of policing as stuff that is done by guys in blue uniforms. It mostly is. Policing is mostly upheld by the police, but anyone is actually capable of it.
As we see the police force being created during the 1600s.
Being very militarized, as well as we see the inclusion of weapons and force into police practices.
And we see these laws
during
against
the
sodomy.
AIDS riots and shit.
And we see these laws against sodomy being created. You can imagine that did not go well. We don't have a lot of information from these time periods.
Records were kept very poorly.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of very specific situations, but you can imagine if, you're doing some petty theft and they want to burn you at the stake, it probably was not great. You can probably imagine that the police were probably a bit more violent and upset towards these gay people committing sodomy. You can imagine that there was some abuse of power there.
Oh, certainly. And we'll see that later. We don't have a lot of information for pre-1900s police tactics in this specific discussion about queer policing, but in the 1900s is where we really see a lot of surveilling and clandestine, under-the-table sting operations that were busting gay bars and following gay people into their homes and trying to catch them in the act of sodomy, stuff like that. And I don't think that just started in the 1960s. Like, this has most certainly been a practice for as long as anti-sodomy statutes have been.
And mayhaps it was a little worse beforehand.
Because there was nobody holding the police accountable. There was no Supreme Court you could go to if you had a problem with the way your case was handled. You could be excluded from the 8th Amendment if Thomas Jefferson got his way. Anyone can engage in policing. Laws would not be enforced if not for police. And gay people have never been treated fairly in post-Columbus America.
In conclusion, the police and the law have not been nice to queer people ever.